Hi, welcome everyone. We're going to give people just a minute to get logged in and then we'll get started. All right, seeing a few people coming in. Just waiting for a few more to join us. Great, I see the numbers trickling up. Welcome everyone. We're just giving people a moment to get logged in. Okay, I think we are good to go. All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're very, very excited to be with you to answer your questions and share some new strategies to help you maximize your use of the Jotform Enterprise platform. Today on the line, we have David, who is our Enterprise Customer Success Manager. He'll be answering your questions and demonstrating how to navigate the platform. And then Kat, our Manager of Enterprise Customer Success, will be monitoring your questions in the chat. So please do put those questions in there. We have a few from registration, but very, very happy to discuss all your questions today and get them answered. So without further ado, let's dig into it. And I'm going to hand it over to David for questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm David Wilson. I'm a customer success manager here at Jotform. Been here for several years. And the purpose of this, like Lainey was saying, is to just have a conversation about Jotform features, things you might be interested in, and basically just learn from, the questions that other people have. So let's go ahead and get started with some questions.
Right, great. Let's see. Kat, do you want to start with the first one?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So we have our very first question here. Is there any team or group task managing items for submissions? If a submission is the request of some type to a team, could one team member complete it and then solve the request?
Yeah, so let me take over sharing here. Go. All right. So for management of submissions, team related, the biggest functionality is going to be the ability to divvy out permissions and manage data in a shared space rather than needing to individually share the form, tables view, inbox view, share full permissions to the form itself, rather than needing to go back and update those permissions and things like that. Once someone does either change teams, leave the organization, someone joins, you can just manage stuff at a team level. And this includes not only the form itself, but submission data, anything like that, with varying different permissions. So on the submission side of things, any form that you move into a team, let's say I wanted to move this form that has a few submissions, anyone who's a member of that team automatically gets granted access to that content with whatever permissions you have granted them. In this case, you have everything from the ability to fully have ownership permissions of the form so that you can actually move the form in and out of the team, data collaborator, collaboration on just the form side of things, collaboration on the data side of things, whatever you want to do in terms of granting those permissions to that individual user who's going to be a member of the team. And then once they're granted those permissions, similar to how they'd have access if they were the form owner or granted full sharing permissions, then they can access the table as if they were, whatever permission set they were granted. Just makes it much, much easier on an ongoing basis to manage the submitted data. On a separate side of sort of data management that isn't necessarily managing the data that's been submitted would be on things like approval flows, where you would normally have to go in and assign an approval flow to a specific user, to specific email addresses, basically needing to specify who the recipient is going to be for that approval. Instead, we have team approvals. So again, this isn't necessarily managing the submitted data in like the table or making edits to the submitted data, but it's managing review and an actionable review of the submitted data. So again, rather than needing to modify this whenever someone leaves the organization or joins the team or leaves the team, all I have to do is assign the approval step to the team. And then it's automatic. Whoever is a member of this team gets assigned that approval when the form is submitted. You get removed from the team and you're no longer assigned those approvals as you go. So not necessarily, again, on the management of the data, but the management of review of the data side of things. But just makes it so much easier, because then if I have 1,000 forms where I'm sharing submission data with different people, where I have approval flows, things like that, rather than needing to go in and actually manually update form by form, I just update the team roster, update permissions, and things like that.
Awesome. Thanks, David. So on the subject of approval flows, we've got a couple of things that are coming in live on that. So really what we're asked, we see they're wanting to learn more about tips and tricks about approval flows. But one thing that we could maybe start with is the question that we have: what is the easiest way to forward a completed form to multiple different users without having to manually type in their emails? So having kind of dynamic approvers or dynamic recipients.
Sure. And I think this one was also attached to a question of the ability to like have a drop-down list of someone's name or people's names, something like that, and then have that automatically populate an email. So there has to be some sort of way to capture the email addresses. There's no automatic update, but you can have it. So let's say this is like my list of names or something like that. And I'll just be a little lazy on this one, call them Bob, Dave, and Mary. So just simply selecting these names doesn't really do anything in terms of assigning an email or anything like that. And we can, of course, set up conditional logic so that, and this is more, not necessarily difficult, but more work in terms of setup. So I could say if list of names is equal to Dave, update another field with the email address Dave or something, or Dave@jotform.com. But what I can also do is I can have what we refer to as calculation values. And this is super helpful for not only like assigning email addresses, but anywhere where you have a text-based value that you want to assign an alternate value to that. In this case, it's going to be an email address. And then what I can do is set a condition to automatically update my email field or short text field or whatever it is that I want to use to have that routing mapped to. And then just use a condition that says if list of names is filled, then I'm going to copy a value, which would copy the alternate value or the calculation value to my other field. So now, as soon as someone fills in or selects a value from that name field, it's going to automatically kick over to my email field the underlying value that I assigned as a calculation value. So again, we could set up individualized conditions for this and do those sorts of things. So where if they select Bob, then it updates with bob@jotform.com, but it's just way easier to have one single condition. And then no need to update conditions or anything like that as you go. If you have additional names that you add, other values that you need to update or anything like that, rather than needing to add a bunch more conditions or anything like that, all I have to do is come in here, update either my list of names and or my calculation values so that I get an associated value with what they're selecting in the easiest way possible.
Wonderful. Thanks, David. All right, so we're shifting on to another question here that it has to do with invoices. So is it possible to create an invoice form that tracks gift card balances? We have vendors who invoice us for services that are charged to accounts with balances that we update manually. Each account has a unique number. Right now, vendors use the form to either enter the amount we owe them, or sorry, not either, to enter the amount that we owe them, and then we update the gift card balance separately. But we'd love to be able to do this all at once in one form. Is this possible?
Not necessarily. You could capture the values and things like that, but there isn't going to be a running total or an account associated with those gift cards that would be possible, at least in Jotform, to update based on, the submitted values. Kind of going towards a little bit more custom solutions. We do, of course, allow for triggering webhooks and things like that. So if you have an external data set that you have the capability to, do a little development work on submit of the form, update or subtract from that gift card balance based on the submitted values, then you could do it in sort of an external data set. But there isn't really anything in Jotform that would allow for updating a separate submission with the value that you're submitting and then subtracting like an account profile or a gift card profile type approach. But, again, if you do have it in an external data set and the capability to have a short script that would target that specific gift card number, subtract from that gift card number, it would be, technically possible, but would require a bit of outside development work in order to be able to do it.
Great. Thank you, David. All right, we've got another question is there an elegant way to attach different types of PDF attachments when different answers are given? This person's looking for not necessarily needing to create different conditions and automated emails. So is there a way in the approval flow, or is there a more elegant way to do that?
So it's going to depend on what type of content you're trying to conditionally include or, optionally include in the PDF. So by default, in the Jotform styled PDFs anyway, not necessarily the smart PDFs because they're static content, but in the Jotform styled PDFs, there's an option to hide empty fields from the body of the PDF. So what I mean by depending on what content, so if I apply text to the body of this PDF, this isn't optional text to include or exclude depending on whether or not this paragraph is shown in the actual form. So regardless of what I enter in the rest of the form, this text is going to be shown. But any fields that I include as a part of the text will either be included or omitted based on whether or not that field is filled. So I can have a few different fields that are here in line, and it'll only include whichever one was filled. So this kind of gives that conditional approach if these fields are being conditionally filled in the form. Outside of that, again, any fields that aren't filled will be automatically omitted. So if you do have like a full section that isn't being filled in, that full section will be left out of the resulting PDF. That would be the closest we have to dynamic content in the PDF without going that route where you are setting up multiple different templates with different content. So if I did need to have full-on blocks of text that were unique to each different layout, then I would have to go that route where I am actually creating different layouts. And then in my form, I can have that conditional email with conditional attachments, essentially. So I would have notification 1, autoresponder 1 that has PDF. Well, I guess I have to refresh this real quick so my layouts pop up. But I can have notification 1 that has PDF1, notification 2 that has PDF2, notification 3 that has PDF3, and then I can conditionally route those specific emails with those attachments. But again, it depends on what content you need to include or exclude. If it's just fields, whether or not they're being filled or not, super easy because it's automatic. If you need to have that more guided approach where it's an actual full-on template, then you would have to go the route with the conditional, well, with multiple emails, different attachments, and then conditions to route those different emails appropriately.
Wonderful. Thanks, David. That's fantastic. I just also did want to mention for enterprise customers, if there's something that David has mentioned that you'd like to explore further, then please reach out to your rep with Jotform. You can also submit a ticket on support, as David is showing right now, or schedule a Zoom meeting with one of our amazing CSMs. So actually, David, while you're within the admin console, could you walk us through maybe some updates that have come to the admin console that some of our enterprise users might not be super familiar with?
Definitely. So the newest ones are going to be a few of the settings, and then also things like system and activity logs. So activity logs aren't necessarily anything new, but they're a bit more robust in terms of what we displayed previously. Just more categories for the logging that is done, more, in-depth look into what's going on your server. So, if you wanted to see things like I've been doing on this call, right? Any of the updates I've made to forms, anything like that. So for the Bobs of the world, where someone's coming in and Bob makes a bunch of changes to a form, and you look at that form and go, what happened here? You know that Bob did it. You know the whole audit trail of what Bob did. But again, it's not necessarily just form activity. It's insight into everything that's going on your server so that you have the ability to know that an approval flow triggered, things like that. System logs are basically more insight into things like emails being triggered. So prior to this being released, if anyone wanted to know logs of their emails being sent out or anything like that, they had to go into their own individual history, look up their own individual email history, and that was as far as even admins were capable of seeing. But with these new system logs, admins can come in here, make sure that emails are sending properly. If anyone has any questions, they don't need to have the individual user look up their own history, bother them to do it. They actually have access and insight to see, make sure that emails are functioning properly, integrations are triggering properly, and things like that. Aside from those settings, a lot of overall server-wide settings to help admins control things like the look of the server environment, but also for security reasons, things like payment integrations. So we have a lot of clients who are a bit wary of allowing their staff to be able to process payments essentially on behalf of the organization. You can come in here and disable payments, make it so that they can only process payments through your approved payment processors and things like that. Similarly with widgets, we have over 300 individual different fields in addition to our basic fields at this point. It can be a bit overwhelming for users who are logging in for the first time, seeing this massive list of fields. You can come in and narrow it down to just the fields that are most useful to your organization. And then I think we actually had another separate question for this at one point, but two-factor authentication, whether or not that's something that's in the works and that's coming, it is coming. I don't have an ETA for when this is going to be rolled out yet, but this isn't something where we're saying, hey, it's, in the future or something like that. We have a version of it available on our demo server, available to us for testing and things like that. So in the works, coming soon-ish, but it is something that we'll have outside of the single sign-on need for two-factor. We will have our own internal two-factor through the regular Jotform login. Things like the ability to set server-wide SMTP sender emails. A lot of organizations want to have the ability to send out emails from their own custom address, but they don't necessarily want to provide all of their internal staff the username and password and SMTP credentials for that sender address. Or they just want to make it easy for people to have that sender address available at the form level without the need for them to go in and set up a custom sender address. But lots of new things that kind of empower the admins on your server to be able to provide a better experience, more customized experience for the people creating forms and their internal users who are going to be using the system, not necessarily filling out forms, but managing stuff within Jotform. But those would be the newest things that we either just released or that are coming very, very soon.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Appreciate that. While we're in the settings here too, so we did have that question about the 2FA, but then with that, there is a question that we have a couple questions as it regards to SSO. So for SSO, is there a difference between SSO for your server and SSO for forms? And then can you require SSO for only certain things like only for submission edits and whatnot?
Yeah, so when single sign-on is enabled for the server, it replaces every single login location with that single sign-on login. So if you have the need to have form-facing single sign-on compared to internal user single sign-on, that currently isn't possible because it's one essentially identity provider, one single sign-on setup per server. Once you have single sign-on set up on the server, the only requirement for login via single sign-on, by default anyway, is for licensed users in the system who will be logging in to do things like creating forms, managing data, and things like that. Where single sign-on becomes optional is at the form level. So I can have the normal form flow where I have my form fields and the form is still public. There's no need for single sign-on. It's not enforced. It's not required. Where single sign-on starts becoming required is when I either make the form private, which would be invite only. So this would still be single sign-on protected, but it would be single sign-on protected and accessible for only the people that I have shared the form with, invited to fill it out. So it would still need to log in via SSO, but unless I've actually like proactively invited them to fill out the form, they still wouldn't be able to access it, even if they have a single sign-on account. If I want to make it easy for anyone with a single sign-on login to be able to fill out the form, but have it private, then I can just simply require SSO. And then rather than the form being public, they have to log in to be able to fill it out. In addition to that, there's also an ability to pre-fill form fields based on the logged in user's single sign-on attributes. So this is my name, last name, address, department, email. Not only the defaults that we have available can be mapped, but you can also have your own, custom attributes and stuff like that. We enable them, and then they can be mapped. But then I log in to fill out the form. It pulls in my name, department, email, whatever it is that I want to pull into the form to have automatically filled out. At the data level, when you are doing things like sharing form data or anything like that, if you are sharing any of the direct submission views with edit access, with anything like that, it's going to require single sign-on login to be able to access the data. So similarly to how you needed a Jotform login to be able to access submitted data, same thing, except it now would require single sign-on. For anything like reports or anywhere where you would normally have the submission data public or just simple password protection, that doesn't require single sign-on unless you make those reports private. Similar to the form, then it requires single sign-on. So it's essentially just a flat replacement to any login that was normally a Jotform login, now becomes a single sign-on login with single sign-on required. And there's no ability to have SSO in one spot versus Jotform login in another spot, or two different, IDPs used for different places. It's kind of all or nothing at this point. Once it's enabled, all logins require SSO.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's fantastic. So we are going to maybe go back to some form builder questions here. And we have another question as it pertains to conditional logic. So if you have questions that only show up with conditional logic, but those questions are indeed required if certain logic is selected, is there a way to make them required?
So we actually had an internal discussion about this with partially filled form fields or email fields recently. And the underlying idea behind required fields is unless they're visible and possible to fill, they shouldn't be required, right? So if I have this short text field here, and I'm just going to call it required field. So if this is required, if it's visible, then of course, it should be required to fill in this field before I can submit the form. But let's say I have a drop-down field. And I'll just call my options 1, 2, and 3. But if I conditionally show this, there's no way for me to fill in this required field in the background. So if I submit this form without that required field, it should let me submit this form. There's no way to make that underlying field required without big headaches when, for some reason, that field doesn't get a value passed to it, or the field doesn't have a default value, or the value gets stripped for some reason conditionally, and there's no way to access it. That would be a big, disruption in the ability to submit the form if for some reason we required that field without the ability to actually have a value in that field. So it was one of those where a partially completed email address was essentially an acceptable value if the field was hidden, even if it was required, because there was no way to update that value without actually displaying that field or doing some like trickery where I'm, entering a value using a URL parameter with something like that. So no way to make a field required fully unless it's visible in the form. And that's, basically it for that one.
Awesome. Thank you, David. All right. So a couple of questions as it regards the file upload field. So we've got a couple. How can a minimum number of files to be uploaded to the upload field be set? And then also just talk about the total size limit. How can we set that as well?
So there's no minimum number of files that can be required. You can set a maximum. So you can limit it to 10 or whatever it is that you want to do. But this is essentially a range from if the field is required from 1 to 10. So it's not like the number field where I can have, a specific range that has to be required. It's essentially a cap. You can limit the file sizing required. So if you want to make sure, like if you have a standard file size, this would kind of be the way to fudge it. So if each file that they're going to be uploading is 1 megabyte, and it's going to be 1 megabyte or at least 1 megabyte, you can say, okay, 5 megabytes is the minimum file sizing total, but there's no way to force that to be the minimum number of files. And what was the other question on that?
That was, yeah, the total size limit. So we've covered that. And then the minimum number of files to be uploaded, if we can set that, which you had also shown us in the multiple tab there. So that's great. Okay, fabulous. So we are going to head to still within our form builder here, but just in the publish tab. Is the username able to be removed from custom URLs?
No. So the username for the account is part of how the form is looked up when you're using a custom URL. So typically when you're not using a custom URL, pop this out here, the lookup is done based on the form ID number. In the absence of the form ID number, the unique lookup is done based on the account username. So like, let's say both me and Kat have the same ending to our forms. We call it like form 123. It's ensuring there's uniqueness between our two accounts because our account usernames are included as a part of the URL. What you can do though, is go into the admin console or have one of the admins, just go in and change the username for that account. So I can display whatever it is that I want as a part of the URL simply by changing this username. Just keep in mind that some things like admin and forms and things like that that are already in use by our system shouldn't be used as the username, but I can call this whatever else that I want. And the second thing to keep in mind is if you do have existing custom URLs, just make sure to provide the new updated URL if you do change your username, because it'll break all the old ones that you had with your old username. So definitely doable, just update the username. Just keep in mind that it might cause some hiccups with people using the old URLs and you'd have to provide the new one, but it swaps out for the new username, and then it doesn't have your name or something that is not really relevant to the form URL as a part of the URL.
Awesome. All right, moving over to a question about emails. So is there a way that we can have an autoresponder email sent at a precise time on a specific date?
Yeah, so the autoresponder emails do have this send email later option, but it's not at a specific time. It's just at a specific date. So I can say, I want this autoresponder to be sent out on November 2nd, 2023. But it's going to send it, at a bulk time or on that date at the time they submitted the form, not at a time that you can specify. So date, yes, and you can do a calculated date. You can do, whatever it is that you want to assign for the date. It doesn't have to be like a specific date like this or delayed a specific amount of days. You can actually put two date fields in the form, or 30 days out from the current date, or whatever it is you want to do in terms of like a calculated date, and then map that to a date field, but no time option.
Fabulous. All right, so we have a couple of questions as it pertains to submissions, approvals, and submission editing. So first, is there a way that we can set an expiry duration, or say like a one-time use for submission edit links?
There's not. So basically a submission edit link remains editable unless you disable editing of submissions. So as soon as someone has an edit submission link, unless you actually proactively go in, where's that one? But yeah, unless you actually disable the editing of submissions, if someone has that edit link, it's open until you disable editing of submissions. So there's no expiry date or anything like that on the edits. What you can do is, kind of manipulate the form based on a date field or something like that, and conditionally hide all the fields or something like that, or disable the form completely on a certain date so that the edits can't be made after a certain amount of time. But there's no like, from the time they submit the form, there's a 15-day or 30-day expiry time on the edit submission link. You would have to expire either all of them or leave it open.
And then to that, is there a way that we can disable the submission editing as soon as the submission has been approved?
No. So there's no flag on the submission to say has been edited or has been approved. No further ability to edit. It's just, you can turn off editing, you can leave editing, but it's an all or nothing type setting.
Right. And then finally, for at least as it pertains to submissions, is there a way for our end users or our form respondents to check the approval status of their submissions?
No. So unless they're a licensed user in the system, there's no UI ability for them to check up on their submission status. The way you kind of get those updates would be as a part of the approval flow process. So while they can't necessarily log in and see, if you allow them to, they can log in and see their submitted data, just not the status. But what you can do is, rather than just having an approval that goes to an end, you can send them an update email that says, hey, your submission was approved, your submission was denied, or something like that. So they at least get an update when that approval is processed, prior to sending out whatever emails, whatever PDFs, progressing along the process. You just send them an email letting them know your submission was approved, your submission was denied, rather than just ending the process. But unless they're a licensed user in the system, or if someone has been assigned an approval, then they can see their open approvals that have been assigned to them, but not necessarily approvals that they have initiated.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I know we're getting close to time, so we've just got a couple more questions that we can get to. And of course, if we don't get to your question, or if you have one that's more specific to your use case, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team, open a ticket, whether you're an enterprise or you are a bronze, silver, gold, or free account user. So our final two questions here, again, we're in the form builder, and we're just looking for your favorite widgets and why, if you are able to select out of the many, many that we have.
Yeah, so that one's kind of easy. Configurable list is going to be one of those ones that, unless you're dealing with data via API, or you have like specific sets of questions or need to do conditional logic, for repeating sets of fields, this is the biggest easy mode repeating set of fields you can ever have. Probably one of our most commonly used widgets. We have a full-on guide laying out how to set up the different fields as a part of the set and everything like that. Lots of tickets that have CSS to have this stacked vertically rather than horizontally. But again, the purpose of this field is just to make it extremely easy to have a repeating set of fields for something like dependents, or a set of fields where you don't know how many different sets they're going to need, even if it's just a want for not setting up tons of different conditions to show different sets of fields, which you can have that approach as well. But this just makes it so easy to have a dynamic set of fields that the person filling out the form can add more sets. Form calculation widget would probably be close second. Super powerful in terms of the ability to do things like those conditional updates for the email addresses, like I was showing, manipulating those calculation values behind text-based options. But you can do simple calculations and things like that. And then there's even a full-on list with like trigonometric functions, averages, those type of additional functions that you would need to produce those values, trailing decimal places, read-only, lots of additional options surrounding producing whatever calculation it is based on either values that you're entering as a part of the calculation or ones that are being captured in the form. I'd say for interesting ones, not necessarily the more commonly used ones, would be things like geolocation of the person filling out the form. We have a bail bondsman that has a really cool use case in a school, oddly enough, that are using the same sort of use case, but it's just tracking of the people who are supposed to be checking in to make sure they're checking in where they're checking in from. The bail bondsman does it, of course, because they want to know where people are. And the school does it because they have a lot of students who are studying abroad. And college students like to do things that aren't necessarily what they're supposed to be doing at that time. So it's kind of like not only for the school to be able to, keep tabs on them, but also for their safety and security, right? So if they do go off and do something silly like that, you can, notify the parents, hey, we sent your kid to the UK, but now they're in Germany. You might want to call them and make sure, so not necessarily something that's used more commonly, but one of the ones where I've seen a bunch of use cases that were kind of like, oh, that's kind of cool and useful for a widget that isn't necessarily something that people would normally use.
That's fantastic. Thanks, David. And then rounding out our questions, same thing in our form builder. When is the advanced designer useful? It seems to me that you can do everything in the basic designer tab.
So the basic designer does have the basic settings, right? So for the most commonly used styling, question spacing, font type, style, color scheme, stuff like that, this does most of it. Where the advanced designer starts coming into play is, let me actually grab a multiple choice and a single choice field, would be when you want to start getting into more specific customizations, not only from, like, let's say single choice or multiple choice. I want to change the button template, right? So the basic designer has more overall form-based settings and stylized options and stuff like that, but it doesn't give me an option to change the button template for my single and multiple choice questions. It doesn't give me an option for background images, color scheme at the individual field type level. So advanced designer is when I want to get into the very specific customizations with these easy options. That's where I'd start using the advanced designer. But especially for our internal staff, the advanced designer makes us look like we are CSS wizards. What I'm saying by that is, rather than needing to go like, let's say I want this specific field label to be green compared to another field label, right? Typically, that would require writing some CSS code to be able to modify that specific label to grab the ID for the label and things like that. So when we get support tickets from someone who says, I want this label green, anything like that, I want this bolded, but I don't want my other labels bolded. We come in here, we use this advanced designer, and it writes everything for us. Sometimes we have to do outside of the box stuff. But for this, I just say, if I want to do all labels, I click on it once, and it brings up the ID and code for all labels. I click it again, it brings up the specific label for this field. And then I just say, okay, I want the color to be teal, or, we even have this color palette you can choose from and stuff like that. So it literally just wrote the CSS code for me. And then, if I'm providing assistance on a ticket or something, I'm like, hey, here's the cool code that you need to make this specific label teal, right? So I'm doing things that are typically somewhat complex in terms of grabbing the label, the ID, the proper hex code and everything like that. But I'm not really doing any work other then clicking on this once for the label, click on this again. If I want to, float this right or something like that instead, whatever it is that I want to do in terms of modifying things on a very, very specific and detailed level, that's when this advanced designer comes into play, either clicking on a specific element and just getting the additional styling for that specific element type, rounding off corners more, whatever it is. But not only that, getting to that very specific level where I need a sub-label or something moved around or a field specifically, right aligned compared to right aligning all my fields. This is where the advanced designer really, really comes into play compared to doing things like a one-click color scheme update that updates everything, right? So basic designer is more geared towards updating everything as a whole. Advanced designer is when I want to get down into those very specific things, either field by field, where I want different button styling or something like that, or in the really specific where I'm using CSS code to modify things, but I don't want to go in and go through all the hassle to come in here, grab my field label by inspecting this field and, doing all that nonsense just to get IDs. That advanced designer just writes it all for you, for us, makes you look like you're a CSS wizard, even though you're just clicking a couple buttons and getting the code. But again, basic does basic stuff. When it's overall, advanced is for those more specific options, field by field, input type by input type, or even, targeting specific elements.
Wonderful. Thanks, David. All right, that is all the time that we have for questions today. So I will hand it back over to Lainey. Thanks again, David.
Check it out.
All right, great. Thank you so much, both of you. So yeah, that wraps it up for today. I'm really hoping that everybody got a little bit of something out of that. David, thank you so much for the amazing demos. I know I definitely picked up a few extra tips. And Kat, thank you for running through all those questions and helping us navigate all of that. So thanks everyone for joining us. We have added a few resources here for you to dig in even deeper. There are a ton of resources. As Kat mentioned, you're always welcome to reach out to our wonderful, wonderful support and success teams. But we have a ton of videos for you on YouTube. There is enterprise FAQs as well as API documentation if you want to get into those weeds and really figure out what you need to do, or if you just want to do a little self-help. And we also have an entire series of our lunch and learns. So really, really encourage you to check those out if you need some basics or just a refresher. And there's also a few advanced sessions there. So like I said, tons of resources, and we hope to have more of these. So stay tuned and subscribe, and we look forward to seeing you at another webinar. Thanks so much, everyone.